So here we are. I thank you all for coming. And basically, this is a 5th year anniversary conversation about the exhibition that we're in, but also the history of the space, which are what the pictures are going over here. So, and we have Sara Nadal-Melsio here with us, who's going to ask the tough questions. I'm going to pass the mic to you now, right? Okay, here we go.
So the first thing is I'm going to be talking to David as an artist, as a filmmaker, and as a curator, without really distinguishing the two very, very strictly. And the first thing, I was watching David Dixon's Dead, and there's a scene that's slightly comedic that I like very much, and I thought I wanted to start by that. In the scene, the character of the father has just received the head, David's head, frozen in a cooler. And he's trying to figure out where to put it to drive the head to Oklahoma. Yes, I know. It's not what you were expecting, right?
No.
No, it's comedic, it's low-key, it's not, it seems like a sort of an afterthought. But so he is getting into the car, and the first thing he does is he puts the cooler in the back of the car in the trunk. He thinks about it, he takes it out. Then he puts it in the back seat. He thinks about it, he takes it out. Then he puts it in the front seat, he puts the belt over the cooler, and then sort of looks as if he's going to start the road trip in good company, and then the camera looks up from the point of view of the head onto the father. So the reason why I wanted to talk about this scene is because it seems to me that it sort of captures three possible relationships to the artwork. And three possible narratives of how we relate to it. And I wanted to talk about this with David. In the first one, it seems that there's a sort of a sense of archiving, taking care of. There's a sense of preservation. That it's going to be in the trunk, it's going to be delivered to wherever it goes at the end, in the museum, display, it's going to be worked on by experts. And the second one is sort of a little bit like the curator. You know, the driver is the father. The artwork is in the back seat, is being taken somewhere to be delivered to others. And the third one, which I think is much closer to what David is doing, is the artwork head, corpse, is next to the driver, sharing the ride on a sort of a relationship of equality, but in a twist at the end, one is unsure who's actually doing the driving. You assume it's the father, which sort of chronologically would precede the son, right? There would be a sort of filiation where the father goes before the son, but somehow, because the point of view is from the cooler, you kind of wonder what was first. And I wanted to sort of talk about this because it seems to me that these questions of chronological precedence, the question of like having the dead be next to where we're not in a sort of position of, but sort of sharing a space with us. And I wanted to sort of talk about that sequence and your decisions in terms not just of the way you use certain objects in your artwork, but also in the way that you approach your relationship to spaces that have been occupied by others, and using objects that have been taken from other places that have a previous history. So does that make sense as a beginning?
Yeah, that's good. We can talk for an hour on that right there.
Yeah.
That's a really great question and interesting way to start the conversation. If you haven't seen the film, she gave a brief description of that scene where the father character is taking the son's head to Oklahoma City in a cooler to be cleaned to the skull for an art piece that the son wants to have done after he dies. So, and it is an art piece that I do hope to have complete after I die. My father says he's absolutely not taking my head to Oklahoma City, which I said, I don't really expect you to, you know. But someone presumably should or needs to complete the piece. So it was, and it's interesting we talk about this, the son coming before the father, or forcing the father. So, you know, many of you know I was brought up Southern Baptist, and there are elements of baptism in this exhibition in Narcissism, the idea of seeing oneself reflected in the pool and then falling into the water and re-emerging out of the pool. So to me, the father in the film is playing out what would be ideally the notion of Christian love. So he's doing it for the son despite the fact that he doesn't necessarily believe in what the son believed. So how that relates to say, the archive. Although that scene too, we can go on about that scene for a while, but it's funny to me because not only is the son's head being cleaned to the skull, but his body is being cremated. So the father picks up the head in a cooler to take to Oklahoma City, which there is a place in Oklahoma, by the way, called Skulls Unlimited, that cleans skeletons. And so in the movie, in the documentary parts of the movie, I actually do go to Oklahoma City and I interview the people there and ask if they'd be willing to clean my skull after I die. And I thought that would be shocking to them, but in fact not at all. And they deal with this kind of thing all the time, but not human remains. Mostly animals, like skeletons for hunters and things like that. And they have a museum there of osteological specimens. So the whole scene with taking the skull out of the trunk and then putting it in the back seat and then putting it into the front seat and then seat belting it in was meant to be a kind of criticism of, say, cremation, because he doesn't take the cremated remains out of the trunk because they're decimated. They don't necessarily relate to the son any longer. But the skull still possesses his identity to a degree. So I feel like it creates a bond having the skull as opposed to these, because the film is a proposal for a new kind of death ritual that's based on atavistic now ancestral skull veneration, which the Kota, which is here, practiced in West Africa, which was shut down by missionaries, the Kota and the Fang, but also in catacombs in the Catholic tradition too, where one would preserve the bones. So I could go on, but maybe there's another question in here. But we could jump to the death rituals that the Kota here, because when I was starting the gallery, that movie is what began the gallery in some sense. So the notion of David Dixon is dead was the end of what I call my youthful narcissism. So, it's like sort of the ultimate narcissistic gesture to see one's own death. So that I felt like opened a space to deal with other people's narratives. And that's what allowed me to start to conceive and think about running a gallery. Let's have another question.
They're not questions, it's just like prompts for you to think about. But you sort of clearly are brainstorming, burial rituals and coming up with new forms of mourning or celebration. I think one of the things that's really interesting is the way when you talk about, the fact of the death of David Dixon as being this first step to be able to do the heroic social work that will allow you to become the installer of these other people's work. I think there's something about the way in which you approach the myth of Narcissus in this movie and in all the works that we sort of see the head that we see at the entrance of the gallery is the head that is in the film, and then you have the different reproductions of that. There's a sense in which when you think about the myth of Narcissus, what Narcissus does is he looks at himself in the water and he sees the water is actually only surface. He sees the water as a surface that cannot be touched and cannot be penetrated, because he only sees it as a flat surface. And I think one of the things that you do with sort of going to the end of the myth of Narcissus is you sort of see the surface of the water as a medium, as a sort of something that you can swim in, something you can actually go through. So this idea that instead of avoiding narcissism, one actually traverses it and discovers that in that traversing, narcissism is already filled with other things that do not belong to the self. And another thing that might be interesting in this context is you connect that also with your interest in Courbet, especially in the burial of Ornans, which is a very important painting for you. And you've written and spoken about how, I don't know if you remember the painting. The painting is sort of hailed as the beginning of the realist tradition. It's a painting where there's a sort of a row of people at a burial standing, and then at the front of the painting there is a sort of empty grave, supposedly, a sort of a void, that is the center of the painting, right? And David has an interesting reading of it where he says, well, that is the place that later on the artwork will occupy in Courbet, and that's a particular way of understanding it. But what's really interesting about that painting, and that's where I think we might have an interesting discussion, is that the grave is not empty. In order to bury the corpse, they have to unearth another corpse that was there before, and what you see is a skull. And the skull is not the skull of the person that's being buried, it's the skull that was already there. So this idea of precedence, of going into a space that's already been occupied by others, and this idea that having to acknowledge those precedents that you're not necessarily familiar with at the beginning, I think connects to the way in which you move from narcissism to this idea of becoming a sort of a container for not just your work, but for other people's work. And I think I'd like to sort of, if you go back to the Kota and the way that you think about, you know, the Kota is these monuments that had a sort of a vase on top, and then at the bottom were actually containers for skulls of, like, you know, of predecessors that became sort of the source of magic. In the way that were taken up in the beginning of the century by, say, Picasso and other people, they were sort of chopped off, the way they're shown here, shown as artworks, and the skulls were left in West Africa. So I think there's something about that beheading, that moment of traversing narcissism, and the fact that the grave is never empty. The grave is already occupied by other corpses. That I think connects in the instances, in the way you actually address those topics. Does that make sense as sort of a thing to discuss?
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot in there too.
Okay.
Yeah, really good. Really good. Yeah, I don't know if this is the place then to go into, yeah, because you connected a lot of what I generally consider, I mean, there's a connection between Courbet for me, the Kota reliquary objects, and then you mentioned the more recent ideas, David D'Avignon by Picasso. And I've thought a lot about Courbet's Funeral d'Ornan in relation to the artist in the studio, which is 7 years of his artistic practice there, where he fills the empty grave with the image of the artist in the centrally located elements of those two massive paintings, and then disappears into the grave, into the emptiness, in order to start his landscape painting. So that then when you see a landscape painting by Courbet, for example, you're standing in the place that he once stood when he painted the painting, and he paints with a lot of tactility, so that you can also feel his presence. So I've always seen that as a kind of transference, where you're standing, it speaks to the notion of immortality in art, where you stand in the position that Courbet once stood while painting the painting. Now that's possibly true in other paintings, in all paintings, or even when, say, you read a book, you assume the role of the author when you're reading. But I think in Courbet's progression there from Funeral d'Ornan to the artist in the studio to the landscape paintings, it illustrates that relationship between viewer and author. In this kind of disappearance, okay, so Courbet disappears, and in doing that, he's able, we embody him when looking at the work. And that's what keeps him alive, let's say, his sensibility or his subjective point of view. So, you know, and also narcissism, Courbet was considered a great narcissist. He painted a lot of self-portraits when he was young, and even called himself the most arrogant man in France. And he's kind of the beginning in some way of the self-made artist, let's say, without a patron or without a sponsor of the state. So everybody possibly knows, but he built his own pavilion, right, as a way to counter the salon, which rejected his artist in the studio. So he paid for and built his own pavilion outside, his own exhibition space, basically. So this, you can see for Cathouse FUNeral and for myself, was you know, an interesting reference point of an artist that created his own context, or created the context for his work. And how that relates to David D'Avignon, which is my new sort of thought in relation to Cathouse. So of course, I named the place Cathouse. There's a variety of reasons for that, but the most important one, I think, is that it's you sell yourself in a gallery. So I saw some parallels in the sort of capitalist system where you try to put a qualitative value on or a quantitative value on a qualitative thing. So you have to, there's an uneasy relationship, let's say, between money and art, as there is an uneasy relationship between money and love or sex. So one sells oneself in a gallery, and you can kind of trace that from Courbet sort of having to sell himself, or sell this image of himself, or this idea of himself, to his collectors, which the concept of the sort of individual collector was developing at the time too. So flash forward a few years to Picasso and David D'Avignon. Leo Steinberg's written about it in the Philosophy of the Brothel, the Philosophical Brothel. There was an interesting article recently in Art Forum about the show that was in Paris, I think it was in Paris, of the Rose period and the Blue period, about binaries in Picasso's early work, binary identities. So, using this kind of new contemporary notion and applying it to Picasso, and the way that he had gender fluidity in this early Blue and Rose period. And then the writer sort of ends it with Damoiselles d'Avignon as being, that solidifies his sort of, as we now consider macho Picasso's sort of point of view towards women. Where I would say, okay, but I think that as far as this binary reading of Picasso, that one should include Damoiselles d'Avignon, because having thought about this idea of selling oneself in a gallery in Cathouse, and even that painting behind you there has the coloration of Damoiselles d'Avignon, so I had them on my desktop and I was just looking at them together, and that's when I started to think about it. And I read Leo Steinberg's kind of famous article, essay about it, and he comes close to saying, but doesn't completely, that when you're standing in front of the painting, everything's addressed at you, like the women are all looking outwards, which is innovative at the time. As opposed to, early models or early editions of the painting had figures inside the painting, like the doctor, there's a doctor, and male figures, one pulling back the curtain to reveal the women. He got rid of all of them, and then used the fruit in the front, which is on a table, which is meant to sort of project out into the space that the viewer is standing in, so that you're standing in front of the painting, and the painting's looking at you, and you're looking at the painting. So that's where I'm thinking that Picasso painted, as we know, he painted a portrait in 1907 that uses the same, was it Iberian, was it Spanish?
Style?
Yes.
Yeah, the Iberian style.
The Iberian Spanish style. So, I'm jumping all over here, but he called it the Chicas. The title Damoiselle was given by somebody else. He didn't call it that. So that's French women. And Avignon is a street in Barcelona. So he called it the Chicas, the girls, in Spanish. So they're his peers from his youth, basically, is the way I'm thinking about it. And he portrays, as he often does, portraits of himself, big brown eyes and everything. The women in it look like himself. So my feeling is that he's in this new generation of art entrepreneurs who have to sell themselves to patrons, and that painting is about selling yourself, and and even maybe the brutality of the capitalist system that forces one to sell oneself.
No, that's really interesting that you went back to that, and I wanted to sort of connect these two paintings, the Demoiselles d'Avignon and also the Burial at Ornans, are crossroads paintings in the sense that they mark their sort of thresholds. I think that's one of the reasons you're interested in them. They mark a threshold, and both of them present a multiplicity in place of just the lonely artist. In the Funeral at Ornans, you have a sort of the first time that different classes are represented as equals, precisely because the equalizer is death, right? The fact that there is that grave in front of them makes them absolutely equal in the eyes of the person that looks at the painting. It also sort of demands that you occupy that space at the center, again, to be able to look at it. In the Demoiselles d'Avignon, you're talking about this idea that at some point Picasso does not really comply with that sort of gender binary. It's interesting that he kind of puts himself along the Demoiselles d'Avignon. He does what they do, and they are on the same plane. So the other great equalizer is the idea that we're all for sale. So in these two instances, one is death and the other one is the idea of the market, Cathouse and Funeral House. These are two things that you have actually worked on in your work as a gallery owner, or if you want to talk about it in a different way, maybe as an installer of other people's work within a space that has already been occupied by other things. In this case, by one of them by morticians. You occupy the space of funeral home, and in the other, the space for another artist that designed the whole space to install one single painting. So it looks like a white cube, but it actually is an installation as well for one painting. So you could also sort of see it as having a history that you are sort of occupying. And I like to think about this notion of you occupying a space, right? What does it mean to go into a place that is already embedded in a history, that already has its sort of corpses lying around, its history, and the way that you position yourself vis-a-vis that history? I think to me that's really, really interesting. So I like to think about that, and then the question of your idea of harvesting, the idea that you installed a show, and then somehow that show is also being viewed as a possible remnant that's going to be used again over and over again to produce other artworks. So in a way, that was what was given to you as a sort of accident has become a sort of a method. You arrive at a place that had been occupied by magicians, and you sort of took that as a sort of methodology in the way in which you approach the space of the installation. You're always addressing the thing that was there before, and you're always harvesting and acknowledging that past. And we'll talk about the question of temporality later, because I think it's more complex than that. It's not just past, but do you think we could talk a little bit about those questions?
Yeah, the funny thing is when I moved into the funeral home to live, and then eventually opened the gallery down the hall, that's one reason why it's called Cathouse FUNeral, is that it was originally a funeral home. But everyone would always say, "Oh, do you see a lot of ghosts in there?" And I was kind of hoping to myself, but then realized, no, in fact, if you're a ghost, you don't haunt the funeral home, you haunt the place where you got killed. So in fact, the funeral home itself is the most empty of places. I mean, it's where the dead are. So you try to infuse the dead with life, and I feel like that related to the way the art object functions with its notion of an aura and the community of believers that give it purpose. So basically, it's dead material that, in coming into the community and inspiriting it, if that's a word, or giving it energy and spirit. So that's kind of the way that I guess the gallery sort of evolved. But yeah, the harvestings, yeah, there's a resistance and always a desire for a kind of relic and a maintaining of history. I mean, part of the impulse for myself anyway, getting to art, coming out of the Baptist idea, is, and it's typical of art, is the kind of eternality of it, or the desire for remembrance and an archive, as you say. So the harvestings, which were made from the walls of the gallery and other architectural details, were as relics or ways of sort of preserving elements of the exhibitions, so an artwork can travel beyond an exhibition, but the exhibition itself is singular. So it was a matter of trying to maintain some, other than, say, documentary photography, some real material consequence from the actions that were the space. And then coming out of having made these movies that I was talking about before I opened the gallery, I was thinking sequentially, thinking in scenes, thinking in narrative, and doing one show after another felt to me like scenes in a film, so that the gallery itself was the movie, and then the individual shows were the scenes. And there was a lot of the same process. You set up the scene with the missing scene with the paintings, and the artwork with the artist, and then all the people come for the opening. You take a bunch of pictures to document it, and then you put them on Instagram or on the website for people to actually see. Being in Brooklyn, of course, there wasn't a whole lot of foot traffic, so the method seemed a lot like filmmaking. So that was, and then the notion of whitewashing, the white cube, has been talked about a lot. So in the Cathouse FUNeral space, it started out as a white cube, but never went back to its original white walls. So, for example, if there was something painted on the wall for the artist, or if the artist did something on the wall, we would, instead of painting over it, would either build a new wall in front of it or cut it out, or not everything, but when it seemed like the right thing to do. And not every show produced a harvesting, or necessarily. It's not like there was a program there. It was just a matter of and that's why I call it a harvesting. It was sort of like, if something happened to grow, I would just cut it out like a farmer. It's not like I was ever trying to make those objects that happen. It would just be kind of obvious at some point that this should be kept.
So just to follow along with the question of the way in which you layer things in your paintings, in your practice itself, like how you use remnants of previous shows, you use things that belong to sort of the gallery, for instance, the logo, but you also use elements that have appeared in your films, and elements that have been important in the way you think about rituals of death, for instance. And I wanted to think a little bit about the notion of the crossroads, which seems to be very, very important for you. You go back to it in a way where you sort of, the way I understand it, is you take crossroads as a way to secularize something that has been taken over by religious idiom, in which the crossroads is actually a marker of a moment in between spaces, the living and the death. But a crossroad is also a marker of the moment of the decision, the moment when one goes one way or the other. And the first time I heard you speak about it, you were really going for the way that the crossroads is used in West African religion. You were also talking about the way it's been used in religion, in Christian religion. And the thing that I think I may have mentioned that to you, I was always thinking of the way that crossroads is used in Greek plays. For instance, the most famous one is in Oedipus, right? The crossroads is the place where the event takes place. It is actually a marker of when a person becomes more than one. So when the one becomes the many. Oedipus becomes who he is in his many things: father, son, husband, father, and that's his multiplicity, is the source of his being at the crossroads. And that crossroads becomes a very important element to understand this idea of the self as a multiple. And I think there's a connection there with the way in which you layer elements in your practice. And I'd like to think about this idea of the one in the multiple, and sort of looking at the crossroads as actually, the crossroads has four different possibilities, four possible choices. But at the center of it, at the point where they meet, they're all at the same time at once. There's no choice yet, and that's the multiple. And I wanted to sort of see if you could talk a little bit more about this, because it seems to be very important for you. And we have it here, we have it there, we have it.
Yeah, we have it everywhere,
yeah.
And it is everywhere. It's a cross-cultural sort of symbol. The crossroads, like you say, it's in Greek. It's also in the Kong in China, and Hermes is the god of the crossroads. West Africa, and the way you describe the center of the cross is interesting, because that's exactly where the diamond shape comes in the West African. If you think of Courbet cloths that have come out of weaving, so you have a combination of X's. So if you make a field of X's, you end up with diamond shapes. So you have a kind of dialectical relationship between them. The diamonds are the openings. They're the conduit to the spirit world. And so you can imagine. And the crossroads is sort of the cardinal points, north, south, east, and west. I mean, that's why I feel like it seems to be a kind of universal symbol for that reason. It's a way of trying to orientate oneself in space. But in these kind of religious-based descriptions of the crossroads, I mean, it's orientating yourself in space, but transcendent space, the soul, and both. So in the West African, it's like the horizon line, and then up here is noon, and midnight is down in the underworld, and the sun goes through the 4 points as it goes into the underworld and back up again. So, I mean, that seems like, the Christian cross is the same sort of example, and I'm wearing these Coptic crosses, which come from the 4th century Ethiopia, where that's the first images that we see of like the Christian cross, which is, in my opinion, and a lot of recent scholarship, is the source for the Christian cross. So for example, when the Portuguese ended up in West Africa and the Congo, and they thought they were bringing the image of the true cross to the natives, they're in fact returning the cross to its source, and that is, and there were images. There's this book called The Art of Conversion by Cecile Fremont, which I highly recommend to everyone, that's about this contact, this first contact between the Portuguese and the Congo. And they shared a kind of ideology around the image of the cross. And immediately Alphonse, who was the king of Congo, converted to Christianity without coercion, because they saw the similarity in this cross image. There was a lot of consequence, obviously, out of that. But so there's a deep history there with the notion of the crossroads, and one that. So for me, though, it continues to come up in this notion of narcissism, too. You can think of the there's a great painting by Caravaggio that I know Anthony here has been looking at, but where there's, again, a horizon line, but he's looking down into the reflecting pool, and he's seeing himself reflected. And I used Ouroboros in the logo for this exhibition, where you have this kind of cyclical relationship to the reflected self. And the reflected self in the pool, you said it's surface for narcissists, but I think of it, one can do what one wants with these myths, I guess. I think of it as, at some point, narcissist exhausts the self-subject. At some point, he becomes bored of his own image and falls asleep or falls into it and disappears into his own image, his own death image. He's emptied the self, and then is baptized then, in this kind of, where you're sort of submerged and then re-emerged as what I call a heroic social worker. So he's lost this sense of narcissistic self-reflection, and can then engage in sort of social practice, can engage with others. And when I say he, I mean that's something I think probably Freud and Lacan and a lot of people have had a field day with, but it's something that I feel like is probably latent in all of our sense of self, the notion of identity here.
So you went back to this question of the sort of the movement from the narcissistic, the youthful narcissism to the heroic social worker, and I find it interesting that you actually use these archetypes and the way you use them, because it seems to me that one way to think of them is as sort of empty as containers. You have these labels that actually are very. They seem like to be very evocative of very precise meaning, but then the way you use them is you use them as a way to create a narrative that contains infinite possibilities, or possibilities that are not narrowed down to one single explanation. So I was thinking about this notion of the container, and the reason why I want to go back to it is one of the things that comes up, and I'm sure you've been asked this, the question of appropriation, right? The question of how do you deal with the fact that you're using these elements from West African religions? How do you use the fact that you're actually taking wall space from another painter, incorporating it into your work? So the question of appropriation is one way to look at it, and potentially a sort of one that walks a fine line is potentially very problematic. But it seems to me that in your particular case, and I think that's why the archetypes really help, what you actually are doing is you're sort of transforming yourself into a sort of a container. You're transforming yourself as something, as a structure that contains others as well as yourself. So in that way, there's sort of an equalizer in that first, when the idea of the social, the youthful narcissism, you say that you sort of exhaust the self. And to me, what I hear is I empty it out. I empty it out so it can contain other things. I empty it out so I can become, a vessel for other things to happen. And I think that's one possible way to think of it. And the way in which you treat your spaces too, this idea that somehow there is a sort of, that space has become sort of a place where things can happen within those walls. And this idea of containment as not a source of restriction, but as a source of possibility might be interesting too, because, for instance, even the archetypes could seem a little bit constricting. Why would you label yourself as with youthful narcissism or the heroic social worker? Well, that label is also sort of an empty sort of archetype that you can fill with a sort of endless amount of narratives in your films. So I wanted to think about this notion of your relationship to this idea of being a container.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, it's funny. I'm just thinking here, the gallery is kind of an empty grave in some way. And I had a line that I used quite a while ago in a performance called "Do not fill the emptiness of the grave with the cement of belief." So a gallery is kind of built to be in rotation. It's this whitewashed space that erases time, but it's one that can be constantly filled with new and innovative ideas. And the white cube, it's not arbitrary. As soon as I started painting those walls at Cathouse FUNeral, it became an issue with the individual artist. I mean, there was something that had to be negotiated then. Do we leave this? Do we not? How do we know where my work begins and yours ends? So, it's not necessarily the white space. You start to see why it works so well as a kind of machine for innovation. So that you bring something in, you take it out. You bring something else in, and you constantly can be changing as a result. I mean, the FUNeral space was always trying to keep things. So in some way, I mean, that's conservative, you might say. I mean, we're trying to conserve things. The funny thing was, as soon as opening the gallery too, this very, we have this, how Muhammad Ali or Dali would speak of themselves in the third person. With the gallery then, even though I was the only person working there, I could use the term we all the time. So I ended up with this royal we, instead of I, and even that seemed modest, you know. It was like, because I shouldn't be attributing the work to myself. It was collaborative with the other artists, and it was not only, but it was also the conditions that the space were determining. So it wasn't just me motivating, right? So it was a we, and it was plural. And I think by having this container, this empty container of a gallery, that that it became multiple in that sense too. That you. I became we. There was an appropriation, right? So as a curator, that's pretty much all you can do. You don't make the work yourself, so you borrow from others to construct your narrative, or what's supposed to be a reflection of the cultural moment. So that's kind of an accepted norm with curating. As an artist, though, you know, we have our 80s notion of appropriation, where you would take something and use it sort of irreverently and empty it of its former meaning, and use it against itself in many ways. I think David Sally is the perfect example of just putting one thing next to another, or Chaim Steinbeck's shelf. You know, that I think of Chaim Steinbeck's shelves a lot when I'm thinking about the gallery, because the shelf, you could put anything on there. And just due to the fact that they're both on a shelf, you have to try to rectify why. You know, it's like putting anything within a frame or anything within a gallery walls. You immediately have to try to sort of connect the reasons. You know that they were put there for, you assume they were put there for a reason, and you try to deduce what that purpose is. So then there's the stickier issue now of cultural appropriation, which one steps into very quickly as a curator and as an artist or as a thinker or as a person. I mean, if you read James Baldwin, you assume his subject position in reading, so you appropriate to some degree his voice. And then it should transform you in some way in the experience, you've then appropriated James Baldwin to a degree. So I think it's a somewhat unavoidable aspect of knowing and of experience. But of course, when I think the term is used pejoratively, it means that you're using, in this 80s kind of way, of using it as an empty signifier and once again, irreverent in some way to its source. And when it gets into cultural issues, that can seem flip and inconsiderate and even violent to some degree. I think of the cornrows, the controversy with Katy Perry, who did this horrible music video. But juxtaposed with Alexander McQueen, who also did a runway show using cornrows on white models. To me, they're not equivalent in some way, because McQueen seems to be advancing somehow the discourse around cornrows, for example, as opposed to Katy Perry, who was just using it as an empty signifier. So, I mean, I feel like that maybe there is a line there where you can say, for example, okay, so the black surfaces that are on the silkscreen pieces in the entranceway for the show are from Tariq Shifaral's show. So Tariq Shifaral is born in Ethiopia, grew up in LA. He's African American. So we did a show together in here. We talked about what we should do, what we should exhibit, how we should exhibit, what it meant, all kinds of things. And one of the things we wanted to address, or he wanted to address, was the white cube. The white cube as a white cultural space. So we thought, we'll make the walls black. And his paintings are representations to a degree of black bodies. It seemed appropriate that a black body should be on a black wall, not a white wall. And especially because they actually look better on black walls because the contrast isn't as high between them. So in the entranceway we put and I'm using we, I actually did the work, but he approved of it. And the technique, which was black plaster with some paint on top and everything. So that had a texture. It wasn't also industrial white wall paint. It had some feel to it. His paintings were hung on top of that. So after that show was over, rather than just throw away, as we go from the other space, those walls, I cut them down into these 32 by 24 inch, out of the 8 by 4 sheetrock into these squares, and rectangles, and I didn't know what I was going to do with them, but I asked if it was okay if I kept them, and he said yes, and I eventually came to use them in this show. So that's a kind of cultural appropriation of Tariqu's work in a curatorial way, the work that I'm doing here, we're talking about these kind of binaries of Narcissus looking into his reflection, which is his other, but also the show has elements here of the Kota being contrasted with the artist in the studio sculpture that I did. That's my own white man deadhead in the studio. So, and there's the one painting where, especially where here they're facing each other off, but in the other one, they're actually in the same painting, and the painting can be hung with either one on top, so it reverses like that. So, it seems to me that with Taraku ended up to be, even though his show was his show, obviously, after I used those walls, it was an exchange. It was a collaborative exchange to a degree. His show, I would say, absolutely wasn't a collaboration. That was his show. So this is where the lines get blurry. But afterwards, when I was able to use his walls and the conversations that we had that led to it, I don't feel like that's a cultural appropriation because it was collaborative, and I did it with him and with his permission and in conversation with him, as opposed to Picasso, for example, who gets often criticized for his cultural appropriation of the Kota, which, for example, and this is another thing that's in the Cathouse FUNeral here, is that the Kota reliquary object, Sara pointed on this a little bit, was the first African sculpture that Picasso collected. So the first piece that he bought was a Kota reliquary object, which was cut off, like Sara said, at the neck, or the legs, which would touch the sacra, which was the ancestral skulls in a basket. And so it was cut by the missionaries and whomever and shipped to Europe, where Picasso found it in the Trocadero and purchased it, and not knowing what it was or where it came from. So this, I don't think, culturally we can be to blame for that. I don't know if Picasso specifically can, because what he does is invest those objects which were being disregarded with meaning. There were his own meanings, but he couldn't have known the scholarship about these is very recent, as a matter of fact. I mean, there was a big show at the Met in 2008, which was incredible, Eternal Ancestors, where they had 4 of these baskets intact with the sculpture, with the skulls. You couldn't see the skulls. They were very cagey about what was in those baskets, because it's kind of controversial. This is the people's actual remains. And there's only 8 of those baskets intact in the world with those sculptures still attached, which to me is mind-blowing, and they have to be some of the most precious objects. Now, I can go on, because I should, but about appropriation, because the first, this whole film project, David Dixon is Dead, where I was talking about cleaning the skull, the reason I came up with that idea, what first struck me, was I was in the Quai Branly, controversial, oceanic and tribal, as they used to say, art museum in Paris, the Quai Branly. They had Osmot skulls on display. Osmot skulls, actual skulls, ancestral skulls. I didn't know that. I thought they were trophy skulls. I don't read French. They're decorated with all kinds of things, and they're beautiful, right? So I go home, and then my friend says, no, those weren't ancestral. They weren't trophy skulls. They're ancestral skulls. And my mother had just died, and I thought, you can keep the skull, of your loved one, And at first it seemed creepy, but then it was just like, yeah, why not? Why not? That is like the most precious object one could have, and we just burn them or throw them away, basically, or bury them in the ground, especially if that ground's not holy ground anymore. If you don't believe in a transcendent soul, that material, that skull, is the most permanent thing of that person, and it is that person after they're dead, because there's nothing else. And if it's kept with attached memory, and this is what that project, Museum Mausoleum, is meant to do, with attached memory, as opposed to a specimen that you use in science. We do that all the time. You have a skull in the real too. You're allowed to collect them, frankly. There's no rule against it. But as long as it's not connected to a person or history, we don't find it weird. It's a specimen. It's just, but that's the problem right there, is because you've just made this person into just material, just empty, meaningless material to be studied. And that project was meant to keep the skull connected to its lived history, let's say, right? So I think that there's a lot about art and the way that we think about art and the materiality of art in that project of keeping the skull.
One of the things, the reason why I was mentioning the idea of containing when I mentioned appropriation is because it might be a more generous way to think about the practice that you're doing, in the sense that, you know, there's something about the skull is also a container, and the idea that somehow what you do is you cradle, you kind of just sustain that skull, you sustain that memory, you sustain that space. And I wanted to talk a little bit about the notion of relic, and the notion of the way in which you use remnants in your work. And one of the things that I was struck by when I saw the way that you incorporated these pieces, and I did not want to think just about appropriation, it seemed too facile, is that one of the things is that these seem to be remnants and relics of something. But the more I thought about it, and then when I saw your slideshow, with this basically about relationships, it's about people that you meet, and people that are in the gallery, and situations that take place in the gallery. The gallery also contains a situation that is made with the relationship with other people, these conversations, what is happening right now. And it seemed to me that the more I thought about it, that the relics that you actually collect, the harvestings, and I'm calling them relics now, are relics for that unique situation that has been lost to you.
Yeah.
So that they actually, what they're commemorating is not the object that you have sort of preserved or cut out, but they are relics of this unique, singular moment of relationship in this space between people that has been lost forever.
Yeah.
And I think this idea of mourning, this idea of like, it's at the very beginning of your work with the notion of narcissism, which is basically mourning for a wholeness. And then eventually with this idea that there might be an emptiness that was once empty, which is also a sort of an idea that one constructs as a sort of narcissism. I kind of wanted to think about this notion of your need to somehow commemorate and mourn this moment of, in a way, a moment of a community. Yeah. And I think that is something that maybe sometimes gets lost in translation. And I was really struck by the fact that you chose to use a lot of your slides are about the people that are in the space. And I wanted to think about this notion as like, what are you commemorating when you take those pieces, those material pieces of the walls that contained that relationship with others?
Yeah. So there's a lot in there. The difference between a relic and an art object, I think, is significant. You know, you can have a relic that is just, or like say a historical object that has some sort of significance, and you keep it as a way to connect you to that past. The harvestings as they were chosen, though, weren't just arbitrary. You know, you can't, like a ready-made by Duchamp, not everything works. So they were chosen on aesthetic grounds, even though they were also relics of the exhibitions. So, you know, like I say, not every show had a harvesting, and it was, so, you know, an art object, I feel like, is different than a historical relic because it has its own internal frame, it has its own inherent value beyond its objecthood as a relic. So I think that's one way to think about the harvestings, as being relics, but more than relics, in the way that an art object is more than just, it's part relic, but it's also, there's something extra in an art object. I mean, the exhibitions with the people, you know, and the community, the notion of community, I mean, everything has community in some way, so it becomes kind of like, you know, football teams, people go to games, you know, there's church, has all people that come together around a common purpose. So I mean, art is one of those kinds of containers for community, and it's certainly relevant, if not the thing itself that makes art valuable to us. I do see that as a kind of, I guess, Hegelian in the sense that as a kind of religious practice, and that the way that I engage with art and is that it's a way to fill that kind of the kind of meanings, and those would also be historical and then also eternal meanings that you know, the human spirit craves, I guess.
So would you say then, just as a follow-up question, would you say that basically in your work, the artwork occupies the place of the relic? That's something about the way in which you sort of take, there's a sort of undercurrent of sort of a religious discourse in which it seems like sort of the artwork comes as an afterthought. It comes as, not as an afterthought, it comes as a sort of occupation of a space that was once belonging to religion in some of the itineraries that you make in your work.
Yeah.
Do you think that would be accurate?
Yes, yes. I think these kind of white cube rituals that we perform repeatedly in Chelsea, despite their commercial elements, which can be talked about too, and usually is, unfortunately, it's a bizarre behavioral, cultural thing that we do, and I don't think we really think about it in the same way that people went to church probably in the 12th century without thinking about it too much either. It was just the world as you knew it, and it was a way to bring meaning to the world that we lived in.
Mm-hmm. And you said something about there's communities everywhere, there's communities in all sorts of ways, but I also think that you also say in your work, I've heard you talk about this, that there's something about the specificity of the artwork and its distinctiveness from life is important to you. And you talk about, art to life, to art, and life to art. So I think there's something about, yes, this community may be like any other community, but it's a community that only exists because this other space has been created. So I like the space that you give in the gallery, the space that is surrounding the artwork.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to talk about this notion of this autonomy as a site of resistance of the artwork and how that is important to you. Because you have mentioned to me, I think I've heard you speak about this question of not maintaining the difference, maintaining the separation as an important element, right?
Yeah, that's definitely good. Yeah, the sort of the slogan which you see here for the Cathouse FUNeral was art, or life to life, which is always, you can see, somewhat circular and off center, which is something that, so that it implies that it's partial, but it becomes cyclical. So it's art, life to art to life to art to life, and you can substitute, and it's the Narcissist myth again. It's the Crossroads. It's all of that, where it should probably be life to death to life to death. I mean, if you think about death and transformation, or life and transformation, those kinds of ideas. But so art is sort of a stand-in then for death in the way that I think it's being used there. And and then this idea of a separation between life and art is something that I kind of advocate for. Although these lines are very blurry and difficult to define, but one of the big 20th century sort of notions was that art should be folded into life in a kind of completing a kind of in a kind of contemporary political act, where if art should directly relate to the now, and the second it becomes put in a museum, i.e. taken out of the flow of normal temporal time, that it became ossified and it became like a relic and a one that's dead. So the idea of a museum as a mausoleum, as Adorno talks about it. So, but as Proust says, when you come in contact with that dead object, the mausoleum or the museum, when your subjectivity comes in contact with that other subject, you bring life to it, and then so that becomes the cyclical relationship of life to art to life, as opposed to trying to fold art into life, where art basically gets consumed by it, or by life, and disappears completely. I mean, it's interesting if you think of animism and other kinds of, say, pre-modern religious performances or ways of thinking, where everything was infused with the spirit, Whereas with modern and the development of the museum and the way that we think about art now as kind of an extension or something that when science and art separated, or with the death of religion or something like this, that art became that space, unlike animism, where you can step outside of life somehow, in some sort of imaginary way. This is where you go into the grave or into that reflective thing of Narcissus, where you can, like, you go into a movie theater and it's dark, and you live someone else's experience for 2 hours, and then you forget yourself, and you come back out to reflect on that experience, that other person's experience, and your own as a consequence. So you kind of die in that moment to yourself and open yourself to another experience. You do that when you read a book, for example. You silence your own inner voice, and you let someone else's take over. So I feel like that's something to do with human consciousness and the way that humans are able to think. And that would be the sort of the art death part that separates from the sort of quotidian flow of time that I think we do sort of habitually without thinking about it when we read a book or when we go to an art museum. It's kind of built in, and this is part of the way of thinking about Courbet too. It's kind of built into the way that we experience art, as opposed to the way art would have been experienced by deeper and older cultural moments, which they didn't, perform in the same materialist way that we do.
I think we're about an hour now.
Yeah,
I should open it up for questions.
Yeah, yeah. If not, dinner.
Should I pass the microphone
Oh,
around?
I don't think we need the mic. I'll restate the question if necessary.
Okay.
Okay. Any questions, or you've been berated enough, John? Sorry, Anna. Yeah.
So there's this idea these days for novelists to create autofiction.
Autofiction.
Yeah, to have themselves as sort of subject in a different way than autobiography or sort of older novels. And I was just wondering, how David Dixon character
Yeah, quote unquote.
seems to would be like a container, kind of self-like you, but different.
Yeah, it happens. It happens to all of us when we think of ourselves in time, as historical characters, which we can do. Think of yourself in the third person as opposed to the first person. That's a consequence of human consciousness. So, but when you make a movie, for example, and you act in it, in the first film that I made, Unloosened en Route, I set up the beginning saying, "Oh, that's my character, Joe Johnson," but it's not me really, but it's based on my own experience, which it was, so it was partially autobiographical. But I don't know this new literary movement you're talking about. What are some examples? What are some books?
Six-part novel, My Struggle.
No,
Oh, My Struggle.
That's correct.
Yeah.
That's an example.
So that's thought of not as like Proust or anything like that. Or?
Well, the character is the main character is the author,
Right.
but a little bit different than the person who you might meet.
Right.
And so there are different authors who are using that approach in their own ways.
Right.
So, but it's more the question of how you're doing it.
Right. Sure. Yeah. So after the David Dixon is dead, maybe this answers the question a little bit. Everything was like gravy after that, because the whole time I was making the movie, I was just trying not to die, because it just seemed like it would be too absurd, like I cursed myself or something. So, but after that, okay, so you're sort of dead. So then everything else is like post. I'm already in the afterlife. That's how I started. So then, yeah, maybe you can in that afterlife you're already corpse, or you're already emptied, and then that's when you can start to put the quotation marks around yourself, and you reach some sort of like meta self. Carla.
Maybe a follow-up question, but first I have a comment. I really enjoyed how you were able to speak about the history of the space through an analysis of printing. That was very nice, to hear how the ideas of the logic of the space comes from painting history, and that's
FUNeral space.
I just have a comment also in terms of the Picasso duo, right? Like the first painting behind the D'Avignon is actually a saber, so it's a main body that is at the base of the first D'Avignon.
Really?
Which is super. If you see the leg, actually it's the leg of the saber, is a main saber. So they started as main figures, and they transformed into main figures. Anyways, my question was about the future. What would happen after these 5 years?
Oh.
And you're alive.
Yeah, that's good. So putting Cathouse FUNeral in Cathouse Proper, and then using the Ouroboros symbol in the promotion material and everything. Really ideally, the gallery should end. It should like eat itself and disappear. But I didn't want to do that because I wanted the gallery to keep going. But just for conceptual clarity, it should end. But it's not going to. We already know what we're doing next year to a degree. So it's going to keep going. I was thinking about changing the name, but that seems sort of silly too. So we just have to think of it in conceptually like that. So the gallery's going to keep going, but I am sort of trying to think of some larger context, because like the movies, the gallery became like a larger context within which art could come out of for myself, and I like having these kind of larger projects like that then smaller things come out of it. But the gallery is painting in Cathouse FUNeral especially. So coming to this white cube, it has to be respected by and large. So it's the antithesis of what the other space was, which is why it's really exciting to be in here. It's like collage, that other space was like, it always felt like collage to me, or montage, in that each of the exhibitions, like I say, led into the other one. So, you would do something on the wall, but you would keep it for the next show, then you would erase something else, and then the next show would happen, and you would, take something out but put something else in. So the space itself felt like collage, but it was also in time, so that's why it kind of had those cinematographic qualities of montage. Anna.
Yes. I noticed that in both of these, you've been talking a lot about the symbolism of the shapes and crossroads, and then I'm noticing that you have a divide between the two pieces. And I'm wondering if you have a conceptual idea of why you put the separation of the two pieces where you put them.
Yeah, it's definitely a horizon in the way we've been talking about, like with the 4 moments of the sun, where above the horizon is noon and below is midnight, and the sun travels in this diamond shape, through that horizon into the underworld. So I was thinking of it like that. And then practically, they're 7 by 9, they wouldn't fit through the door. So they had to be cut in half, and that was somewhat traumatic, as Lou will tell you. I mean, I was about to start working on that, and I was like, am I a fool? I mean, I can't even get them in the studio door. I mean, I wanted them to be what they needed to be, obviously, but so they had to be cut in half. And so in order to do that in a meaningful way, this one was cut in half after I made it, after I did the whole image. So I cut it at the end, and that one I cut before, that was made cut. So you can actually see the way that the color and the paint and everything, the way the treatment goes up to that line is different in the two paintings. That was to give it some variety. That one's in the center too. This one's not in the center. It's down. So. And then, of course, I wanted the severed Kota head. And, if you just saw these, I was saying about, if you just saw these paintings and you didn't know anything about the gallery and all that, they have to function in that way too. So what is the Cathouse FUNeral? So it's Thanatos and Eros, or Eros and Thanatos. It's death and birth, or life, or it's death and sex. So those two Freudian drives. But I kind of go, this one especially on the black, it's like a devouring angel, I feel like a little bit, And it's the death of the Cathouse, if it's a funeral for the Cathouse. So it's the death of this kind of exploitation that we're talking about, putting I always get this wrong, a quantitative value on a qualitative thing. So, basically capitalism. It's a devouring angel from capitalism. The Kota are going to come back and get us, which they should, and they will. But have you seen the film Burn by Courbet? Anybody seen that? Burn, Marlon Brando? And he's the guy that did. Anyway, at the end, just watch the movie for the end. It's called Burn. It's on YouTube because the guy was a Marxist, so it's free. There's no copyright on the movie. He's the one who did Battle in Algiers. It's the only other movie he made, Courbet, right? And but just watch the movie, and then the last scene, just look at the eyes at the end. And I feel like that's kind of what the Kota is doing here.
What year?
That movie's from 71 or something like that.
Thank
Yeah, Tim. Yeah, Tim.
Just going back, because I love this first comment that you made about the film and the moment in the film of the beheaded maybe David next to maybe Father. And that is very similar, I think, to certain, but almost in the reverse, to certain cuts that you make, David, through your work. Like you notice this sort of beheading, decapitating of things. But what's interesting to me is in the Kota relics, if we can call them that anymore, the ancestry is left behind. So
Yeah.
when they're cut, the familial skulls are left. And what we know and operate symbolically on is this kind of effigy of an actual effigy.
Yeah, that's a good point.
But those kind of abstractions aside, I'm kind of curious if you think about certain relationships that you have with artists that you work with, but also like a lot of people you've ever thought of that relationship to that kind of kin or familial nature
Yeah.
of the skull looking up, or the rubber head, silicon head looking up, which is an effigy of an effigy also, looking up at your father or a father while it's driving somewhere to be preserved, or the beheaded objects that you make in terms of kinship. I mean, I wonder if there's like sort of examples of working, not don't even have to talk about me, but examples of working with artists, or how you think of the family that really circulates around here in terms of that.
Yeah, I love my family, obviously, like we all do, but I do think as artists, there is something about trying to find family in the activities that we do. And for myself, that's certainly the case as well. I mean, I feel like a kinship with artists. William Burroughs in The Cities of the Red Night, he described, there was like the president of whatever, the leader of China and the leader of America, and they were in war or something, and he used the exact same paragraph to describe them. So they have a certain personality type, in other words, leaders of the world type people, as opposed to artists, that have a certain kind of character that you're drawn to. And that's one way to think cross-culturally and cross-ethnicity in some way, is that those are real kinships as far as I'm concerned.
But what about this moment when the film happens around the time of your mother's death, right?
Yeah.
And then that's also the start of how your work then becomes more of a heritage also of other people, rather than just of your own heroic social work, right?
Yes.
Where it starts to become a heroic social work. But I'm wondering how you think of the film and those kind of headings as like, to what degree, like, do you think of it as your family growing in a certain way at the moment of your mother's passing? Or do you, I don't know, is that something that you reflect on?
Yeah, I haven't really thought about a relationship with my mother now, starting the gallery. More of this youthful narcissism idea. But, and I like throwing the youthful in there. I'm glad you used it. It takes the edge off it a little bit.
But there's something, I think this is a really fascinating question, because there's something about reverse filiation in your work, in which sort of you use other artists as your president. And in the film, the moment that there's a cut, the moment there's a beheading, there's always the idea that you become the one that sort of makes the father into the father, or like, you become the vessel. So there's something about the idea that it is a filiation that doesn't follow a chronological order. So the idea of these cuts gives you the possibility of scrambling time. And I think we haven't talked about temporality, but I think that's something that's going on as well. I mean, when you take these walls, you basically made that black wall sort of the origin of the precedent. So you sort of you play with that a little bit. You create these sort of alternative historiographies of the way that the certification of the work works. I think that's sort of also there. Maybe.
Yeah,
I don't know. Is it?
Yeah, because we harvested the walls completely out of the first gallery space, and they were reconfigured in different, configured in different configurations. So yeah, there is a kind of, I guess, and then putting together the slideshow. One of the things I always wanted to do, and I want to make a book this summer, but was to see how the gallery progressed. Like went from one phase to the second phase in sort of chronological order. But seeing everything sort of happen at once too is also illuminating. Like that it all. Because there's some going back and forth, like that linear time is upset by those. When you talk about there's a lot to go into when you talk about the son before the father, because that's a whole Christian idea, which is a complicated one about how the son dies in the father. If the father is God and God is all, and Jesus, in the Trinity, the whole idea of thinking of the Trinity is mortality, mortal man. He dies in the all, but he supersedes the Father because he becomes God himself. I mean, there's a lot of that kind of mixing of temporality, like you talk about. I think in that movie, David Dixon is Dead, and sort of forcing the Father's hand to perform the act of love, even against his own wishes. To kind of force him to be the hero that the son wants him to be. Yes.
I'm just reminiscing
Yeah.
The ash.
Yes.
So what happens to the ash, and do the head and the ash
Oh, yeah.
ever come
Yeah, they come back together. Well, you see, so the movie was made to live out the consequences of a piece that I thought of called Museum Mausoleum, which will have this. It's a self-portrait. I already made it. It's a self-portrait, and my skull should sit inside after it's cleaned, and then in the bottom, and behind glass, are the ashes. So, but in the film, the kind of the way to sort of to make this skull preservation supersede this idea of cremation. You never see the ashes again in the film after the father takes the skull to Oklahoma City. I mean, they just disappear from the narrative in some way. But they should all come together again, and those would be hopefully. Right now, I have like a plastic skull as a model, and the hope is that after I actually do die, that someone, whoever wants it, will carry this stuff out. And you just have to go to Oklahoma City. Jake Villamarante owns Skulls Unlimited, and he's ready.
But the status of the skull is always different. In all these sort of religious references that you use, the status of the skull is different from the body. It is the skull
the
that,
seat.
that...
And it's true with the Osmond, too. This is not just mind-body Descartesian separation, you know. They kept the skull, but nobody knows, I don't know what they did with the skeleton, you know.
But it's serious. I mean, you have built a monument that will somehow, I mean, you fully intend for
Yes.
it to succeed you and be an artwork that lasts in some
Museum.
sort of museum. So is it to have thick leaded glass and a seal, and you figured it out?
It's not so thick, but it gets. And but the idea of what museum was kind of fun to think through. So it seems like it should be with the Fayum paintings in the Egyptian section, you know, which are kind of reliquaries, which were influences, or the Osmond with the skulls, or you know. But no, I thought, and it shouldn't be in a historical survey museum where it can be with its brethren, which are these. It should be in a contemporary museum, and it should always be in a contemporary museum. So even in the future, when we have museums that are different than contemporary museums are now, it should be brought, so the dead is always brought amongst the living. That would be the ideal situation. So it should always be in...
Should be rolled out into the lobby every opening day.
Yeah, something like that. Which, you know, the Egyptians, there's evidence that the mummies were kept in the house for many generations and then disposed of. So they have evidence that they were maybe kept in the foyer or something like this. So you would walk by Granddad and say, like, hey, you know.
So beginning with the end, how do you continue painting?
Beginning with the end of
Your
this?
life.
Oh, yeah, well, that's yeah.
So what are you painting today?
Well, these works here.
So these are...
Yeah. That's a good question. I am still here. I mean, there's the selflessness that's supposed to be the sort of heroic social worker is, you know, it's an ideal of some sort. One never really...
With the gallery.
Yeah, with the gallery. And I would hope that it seems complicated. The narcissism's not completely gone, obviously. Especially in the kind of control. It's even magnified in some way, you know. So, and this is meant to be a criticism in the way. I did a series of paintings called Heroic Social Worker. And I used the text, but the title is Narcissist. So, I mean, I was definitely thinking of it as dialectical. And in the gallery, too. So one still has to bring yourself to the party, unfortunately or fortunately. And, so that never really dies. Is that good? Does everybody want to eat now? Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you for coming.